Welcome back to the Left Lens. It's Danny Haiphong. I'm with my co-host Margaret Kimberley, and this is our election 2020 reaction video. As we're recording right now, the election still has not yet formally ended, but it looks like Joe Biden is at least going to take the Electoral College and be nominated president, elected president. But there's still a lot more to come. And so we thought we would bring our analysis to what has been a pretty chaotic and a very prolonged presidential process for the United States. And yeah, Margaret, so let's get into it. What do you think about all of this? There's so many components to it, but I'll let you just give your initial thoughts so we can get some focus because we could probably hit on a whole number of things.
Yes, we can. Uh, Pun intended, I guess. Yeah, an election night, Tuesday night, I said I'm not sitting up to watch this. I said I'll get up in the morning and I'll find out who won, only to find out that nobody knew who won. Um, and Now it's 2 days after that, and the trends are in Biden's favor. There are some interesting things worthy of note. This where there was more voter participation than ever. This was a record-setting level of voter participation. Both Biden and Trump increased the votes for their party. Trump got even more votes, several million more than he got in 2016. Biden got more votes than even Obama got in 2008, which was considered the high watermark for Democrats. Last time, the surprises were the states that flipped from Democratic to Republican. This time, those states have come back, and the Democrats may have flipped some states that were once reliably blue. So those things are worthy of note. There's some contradictory things. Trump wins Florida, for example, but Floridians also voted to increase the minimum wage in their state. But all in all, we see a election devoid of substance. This was mostly about Trump. There was a huge turnout. I think in 2016, there was not much enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton. She assumed it was all in the bag and didn't campaign the way she should have. People who didn't necessarily want Trump thought she was going to win. They didn't really like her, so they didn't bother to vote. And this time, those people came out, and then some. And the people who are his supporters came out. But this was about Trump, the person. This was about the fact that his appeal is mostly racial. It is about the fact that he openly tells white people he is going to give them some privilege. And there's a reaction, obviously, against that. And I hasten to add, because unless you start out with Trump is a fascist, someone accuses you of being a supporter or an enabler or something. No, I'm not a Trump supporter. Yes, I do think he's awful. But I think the system's awful. So I have not become, I call it Trump-centric, as many people are. So people came out against him and for him. There is a cohort of people in this country, more than 60 million, who are white supremacists. And that does not just mean the KKK or the Proud Boys or the people walking around with automatic weapons. It's people who don't do those things, who may not be honest with pollsters, who also believe in white supremacy and patriarchy. The people who are half the population is repelled by Trump and the other half loves him. So the huge turnout, the turn of events was about him. Biden did not change anything the Democrats usually stand for. I think he could have won. Things would have been decided by Tuesday night if he had espoused even one progressive policy initiative, but the Democrats have this problem in that they are loyal to their donor class. So you can't be for Medicare for all and get money from big pharma and insurance companies. Or belatedly, the last presidential debate, Biden finally said he was in favor of raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. I'm assuming polling told him he'd better say something like that. But COVID is, they talk on and on and on about COVID, 200,000 people dead. It's all Trump's fault. But no mention of the people who are suffering economically because of these shutdowns that have been going on now since March. Millions of people out of work, evicted, on the verge of being evicted. And no mention of how those people are going to be made whole again, that there's going to be any attempt to do that at all. So you have this huge turnout for president, but the Democrats failed to flip the Senate back to their control. They still control the House, but they lost some seats. And what are they saying? They're blaming the left. It's so narrow in Georgia that there have to be some runoffs. And right away, what does Nancy Pelosi say? Well, we can't talk about Medicare for all. We can't be too left wing. So they don't even capitalize on these people, these new people who came out, who could defend them and keep them in power. But they want to stay in power without doing the things that people need them to do.
Yes, well, you hit on so many aspects of this. I myself have been very conservative, so to speak, in talking about this election just because, one, I think we all knew, at least those of us paying attention, knew that this was going to take a while to
Mm-hmm.
develop, that it looked as if on Tuesday, Donald Trump had a serious advantage. Well, we also know that Donald Trump has a particular ideology around the pandemic and that a lot of his supporters went out and voted in person, while
Yep.
most people who had any sort of concern about the pandemic voted by mail. So we knew
Right.
that it was likely going to be a prolonged race. We know that the US electoral system is just riddled with structural problems that not only make the process just not about the will and the interests of ordinary people, but also it makes it so the process itself is always cumbersome, and that
Mm-hmm.
issues like this can come about where during a pandemic there was no preparation as to, well, how can we make sure that this election goes not only smoothly but also quickly? Like
Yep.
this does not look good to the rest of the world. People are making jokes around, around the
And they
world
should.
about the United States, even at the procedural level, being riddled with chaos and problems and issues that seemingly could be easily resolved. But I think more importantly, in terms of the substance of this, what has been troubling to me, and I think what we may see going into a potential Biden administration once he is finally confirmed, it looks like he will get there. Uh, we are looking at, I think, um, a really reactionary electorate. So, of course, it's not good to blame voters for the way that they vote because we know that the system is the problem. But I also think that the electorate has been deeply impacted. People who do vote, people who want to get out to vote for Democrats, for Republicans, take your pick, they are more and more politically aligning themselves further to the right. And this is expressed in this election as almost a do nothing election. We had two candidates who promised nothing but pain, really. I mean, someone like Joe Biden promising to fund the police by billions of dollars more. He's promising more pain, but
Yep.
mainly for black people, for working people. Trump, promising not to sign a stimulus deal, Pelosi doing the same, all of this, where basically the decision was between what kind of pain do you refer for the now hundreds of millions of people here in the United States suffering from the pandemic, suffering from economic crisis, suffering from white supremacy, which, as you said, more and more people are okay with. But I think that's basically always been the case. Now it's being expressed politically so overtly by someone like Trump and Biden, who is an overt white supremacist. It
Mm-hmm.
drives me crazy that people argue otherwise, that somehow he's some more professionalized and less crass than Donald Trump. Joe Biden has a long history of being an overt white supremacist, someone who is also more dangerous in some ways because he has institutional backing. And I've been saying
Yep.
this in private that Trump does not have institutional backing. So even if he does go through all these legal challenges, tries to fight, tries to wall himself in the White House, there will be very few people in the Secret Service, in the intelligence apparatus, in the halls of power who will go along with that
Right.
because at the end of the day, to me, this was a referendum on Trump. It was also a referendum on American exceptionalism. It was about who can more so produce the quote unquote great America that the legions of elites and elite hangers on, which a lot of the electorate is at this point. And to be honest, part of the issue for me is that it seems like the Sanders movement was ready because Bernie Sanders, honestly, at the head, but a lot of the Sanders movement was ready to capitulate to the Democratic Party at very key points in this election, giving Biden all of the space to do what he did, offer nothing.
Mm-hmm.
But because there is this huge crisis, because there's multiple crises in this country, he can just barely survive and walk over the finish line without a mandate to do anything. Not that Democrats necessarily do anything good for people because they have a mandate, but
Mm-hmm.
he has a weak majority in the House, no majority in the Senate. He will be going in ready to just uh, put into place the agenda of the ruling class, of the rich, at the expense of nearly everybody else. And I believe that one of the troubling things about this is that people will have no expectations for Biden. And really, his presidency to me is a placeholder presidency, which will produce 4 years of pain leading into what will likely be another chaotic political situation. Um, we don't have a crystal ball, but without a movement,
Mm-hmm.
we know that things can only get worse from here politically.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Biden, in fact, I argue Biden could be one of the most dangerous presidents ever because you're right. People have been convinced, propagandized is the word, that the only way to get rid of Trump was to stick with the right wing of the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders can't win. Nobody can win who espouses anything people want and consistently want. And so they have given up and, in fact, turned against those people who are defending their interests. So that means Biden, there's going to be a sigh of relief once Trump is gone. People will be ready to support anything Biden does, and they will do their usual. So they didn't get the Senate. I'm not convinced they're sad about that because it's an excuse. Well, we didn't get the Senate, so we lost some of our House seats and blah, 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 blah. So it's going to be why they can't give people what they want. And in so doing, people are going to it's already begun. Do you want Trump? If you ask a question, if you point out Biden's racist past, Kamala Harris is, being a former prosecutor and locking people up. That is what prosecutors do after all. Well, do you want Trump? Well, they're better than Trump. All kinds of arguments. If you point out something that's true about them, that's negative. But that's true, most importantly. So I think we're going to see a public not yet ready to fight for the things they should be fighting for. The people who've been made who are unemployed, who are suffering because of COVID. And things were bad before. Half of all American workers are low wage. The numbers of homeless people, there are homeless encampments all over the country. They're never
Yeah.
mentioned, but they do exist. And that won't change without a mass movement. So, what people ought to do, I'll be surprised if I see it, but the demand should be made now. They should be loud. They should be consistent. People should remember that we get progress when we see politicians in an adversarial light, when we don't see them as our friends, when we don't think this party is the one that's going to help us out. That is what we need to see. But I'm afraid we're going to get more neoliberalism. We're going to get more imperialism. The Democrats are not the party, especially Biden. He was in favor of the Iraq invasion. He's been in favor of every intervention. His attacks on foreign policy have been from the right. Their only opposition to the Venezuelan coup attempt is that it's failed. So he's always been one of the biggest Zionists in the Senate, even before that's one of the reasons I think he was chosen as Obama's running mate. So he's going to be given carte blanche to do whatever he wants. And that to me is very frightening. And we need to be as afraid of him as many people were of Trump.
Exactly. I agree with you completely. The huge mistake I think that's made every election, but especially in a time of crisis, is the fact that every election we're told that people should uh, just focus on the candidates, focus on voting, whichever candidate of the duopoly is running, and allow them to kind of lead the policy discussion. But the big problem with this now is that nothing is on the table. And always the big problem with this is that it's always been a foil to suppress political aspirations, ideas, potential movements, actually existing movements, which threaten the status quo. And from the very beginning, Joe Biden and Donald Trump should not have been allowed, especially Joe Biden, since Joe Biden is running as the opposition to the incumbent. But neither of them should have been allowed to behave the way that they did during a pandemic, during an economic crisis, during a period where the threat of a catastrophe, both in terms of the environment and in terms of the ways in which the United States behaves around the world as an aggressor toward countries like China and Russia. It should never these candidates should never have been allowed to do what they did, which is to stoke fear, to avoid all issues, to basically speak to their donors and their donors alone. And
Mm-hmm.
now, which I think is the big problem that we should be paying attention to ahead of us, now the narrative will be, well, we can elect someone like Biden, a moderate. We don't need the left. The left needs to be marginalized further. And that's already what's happening.
Yep.
Pelosi, others are already speaking the language of, well, we need to get rid of that socialist word because that socialist word actually hurt us in the House. This is a big problem. We're going to blame all of it on there. But also, we're not out of the woods with Russiagate. We're not out of the woods with these conflicts with China that the United States is spurring. We're not out of the woods in the foreign policy realm. We know that more powerful interests in the electorate really push, U.S. presidents, the Oval Office, push Congress to wage endless war. And with the political situation being as it is, measured by how this election played out, to me, there is no stopping Joe Biden from being a president that can do even far worse than um, than Donald Trump because he has institutional backing, because he will not see much opposition on the things that hurt people the most. Yes, sure, he will see a lot of opposition to certain key issues. I'm sure Republicans will go up in arms about any sort of virtue signaling to, let's say, Black Lives Matter or even the Paris Climate Accord. I'm sure we'll see that. But on the things that really hurt people, the austerity, the continuously increasing the budget for the military, the complete silence on the real material issues that affect people, like mass incarceration, we
Mm-hmm.
won't see any debate or discussion about that. The US's presence in Africa. We can go on and on and on. We won't see discussion about that, and we'll likely see that get worse, and we'll probably see developments occur that may or may not be reported by the corporate media, which reflect a more unified, a more stable governance of the ruling class that Biden represents than a Donald Trump who, for all of the terrible things about Donald Trump, the one positive he brought was the fact that he did anger some sections of the ruling class, and it did create a kind of gridlock that disallowed, some things from really escalating. Let's say with the DPRK, for example, there was a huge conflict over that
Mhm.
issue. The idea of negotiating with the DPRK was seen as criminal versus Donald
Right.
Trump saying, well, I need a legacy. I'm president. I need to choose one of these issues to not be a complete and total hawk on. And he chose that one. And I feel like with Biden, there is carte blanche, as you said, to do whatever the ruling class wants. And even on issues that Democrats may not agree on, he will still be steered in that direction because the weight of capital is much more powerful than the weight of partisan differences. And that's just the lessons we learn time and time again.
Sure, sure. I also think Trump's election was traumatic. It was not expected. We were told it couldn't happen, and then it does happen, and he's as horrible as he is, and we find out half the country is as horrible as he is. It's all been very traumatic. He blew up the system in getting the nomination, in getting elected, and in maintaining a decent level of popularity while he was president. So we have an electoral process that's still a little off kilter because of him. But you're right. We have we have a promise of pain, and even in an effort to try to get more progressives to come out. So he would say, we'll forgive student loan debt if you went to a public college and if your parents made only X amount of money, we'll just forgive it all. I mean, I think that's something that would be a winner, but we're not getting that. We are getting a man, by the way, who is not healthy. Am I the only one who remembers his eyes started bleeding during a debate with the other Democrats? That he has this definite cognitive problem. It's not just a stutter, but they want him and they want Kamala Harris. I remember the day after it was announced she would be the running mate, I saw these headlines: Wall Street breathes a sigh of relief. Well, yeah, they would. So that's what we have. We have more pain. We don't have I have not heard enunciated a plan to help people who are suffering during this pandemic. There needs to be an unprecedented stimulus bill. The states and cities are suffering. Here in New York, the New York State's broke. New York City's broke. Um, we need to help all the states, all the localities in the country. And because they couldn't get the Senate, they're not going to, well, who knows what they would have done if they had gotten it? I don't know. It would be interesting to see what sort of excuses they'd make. But here we are with electorate that has been browbeaten into moving to the right, and um, and we get this guy he was never very smart. I remember there was these running jokes about him in The Onion. We would be fixing his car or something like that. He was a joke. And but now he's going to be elderly man, not well, is going to be president under all of the pressure of the donor class. It's funny. I just wanted to mention really quickly that the CEO of Boeing and I think the CEO of Raytheon, they both said, "Oh, we don't care who wins. That's because they know they're going to be taken care of. They don't have to worry about anything." And that's where we are now.
Yes, there are many forces in the corporate sector, in the
Hmm.
the real halls of power, the real arenas of power that are very happy about Joe Biden. Healthcare stocks
Sure.
are up. With Kamala Harris, we saw prison stocks rise immensely. So there are lots of forces, not the right ones, who are in complete understanding that they will have their interests met. Now, for the rest of us, a lot more is uncertain, but given who Joe Biden is, we can be certain that he will not necessarily cave when there are no demands placed at his feet. And I think the genius of this neoliberal period, and I know that it's been a very long week for everybody and for us as well. So we won't be going as long as we generally do, but the genius of neoliberalism is that the way that the ideology of neoliberalism works is that it has you believe that there is no alternative. It's not just that there's no alternative to the system itself, it's there's no alternative to the circumstances that the system produces and the conditions that it produces. So people don't believe that this system can produce a change that will impact their lives in meaningful ways. And a lot of people in this election have shown that they're okay with that so long as they are satisfied in more uh, unsubstantive areas. And I think this is where the election has come into play, where Donald Trump has so traumatized a large section of the electorate. And Joe Biden and the Democrats have also done their own kind of traumatization of a particular section of the electorate. They've embedded this idea that it is okay to, some people call it incremental change. I call it flatline change. There's no possibility for change, and that ultimately shapes people's vision of what politics are right now. And so, because the corporate media got people into a frenzy, because the two corporate parties uh, addressed the crisis in the way they did, mostly through fear, uh, and just a complete lack of um, any sort of substantive policies. The genius of neoliberalism is that a lot of people, even if they're not okay with it, they don't have any vision for what they should do to address these issues, and so they're willing to settle. And I know Glenn Ford talks about this a lot, this notion of quote unquote shit jobs, right?
Yep.
This idea that people will settle. There isn't, because people are so desperate, there isn't really a desire or a will or even a framework of organization where people
Mhm.
can challenge these monumental problems that affect their lives, austerity, the fact that the capitalist economy is completely low wage
Yep.
in the United States has driven, and capitalism has driven itself into a dead end in this way. But people right now are not ready, it seems like, to take that next step in saying, no, this isn't good enough. This isn't enough for me. Ideologically, we've had some progress, and I think that's good. More people want these things, which is great, because during the Obama period, a lot of people were fine with settling for policies that were not even piecemeal. They were actually exacerbations of the problem, like the
Mhm.
Affordable Care Act. But still, the ideology uh, hasn't caught up with people's actual activities and what they're willing to do and challenge. The power of the corporate media and the power of the duopoly still reigns supreme, and we have to
Yep.
acknowledge that before we can move forward, because I do think that there is some naivete around uh, the so-called kind of progressive wave of the Democratic Party, where this problem is seen as either secondary or it's ignored. This problem that, yeah, no, this the power of these institutions still reigns supreme, and we have a whole lot of fighting to do so we can get out of what I think is going to be a political crisis, which not only ensures the continuation of this economic crisis and everything that we've talked about thus far, but also leaves us unprepared for some really grave humanity endangering things to come, like the way the United States is posturing towards China, towards Russia, like the way the environmental situation is going, and like the way that people all over the world and people here are being tortured, killed, murdered right now. That's one of the big things that got me was that in every election cycle, you know that people are going to ignore these things.
Hmm.
A lot of people aren't going to know about a lot of the just abhorrent policies of the U.S. empire domestically and abroad. But during this moment of crisis, this really watershed moment in a lot of ways, to have this kind of response, to have kind of almost a lack of spontaneous anger and more of a um, kind of coordinated response to get Trump out, I
Hmm.
think says a lot about the way in which the decline of the U.S. empire, the decline of U.S. capitalism, of U.S. imperialism, is parallel to the decline of progressive thinking and action and radical politics in action. Even as we see people wanting more, we see a decline in the actual capacity to uh, step beyond the bounds drawn by neoliberalism.
Yeah, so people have been told this is all you get. It can't be any better. And things that have happened in my lifetime, we're told we can never have again. The idea of free college or cheap college. Public universities were extremely cheap. Let's say up until the 70s, early 80s. We had that. We used to have a minimum wage that went up all the time. Every year it went up a little, a little, a little, and now hasn't gone up for years. And people will now argue against mobilizing for those things because they've been convinced that nobody else wants that. Well, you may want Medicare for all, but other people are right wingers and they won't want it, and so you can't have it. So you have to live with this system where you Obamacare gave people the right to buy insurance that was very expensive and then didn't take care of them. So people get sick and go broke. But we're told that's it. That's all you're going to get in this country. You can't talk about a military budget that eats up 60% of the discretionary budget. It's things that in my lifetime you used to have in public schools, and you used to have art and music for kids. It doesn't happen anymore. It was taken away little by little. And so now we have people who don't even have, as you're pointing out, real work, low wage work, hourly work, the so called gig economy, everything used to just crush people, to crush their hopes, to make them, to convince them that they cannot get anything more than they have. This mad scramble to survive. So so yeah, that's what we're looking at. We have a beaten down public. People have just been beaten down and are convinced that agitating for themselves will hurt them more. So it's and none of those are going to get better with Biden because the specter of Trump is still hanging over people's heads.
Right. Exactly. Well, on that note, we'll close. Definitely, try to stay well, everybody, during the selection process. Get but really get into the struggle. I think that's what we're
Yep.
always talking about. Get involved in some way that is not tied to the duopoly. We learned this lesson over and over again. I don't think amid a pandemic and an economic crisis, we could have gotten a deeper lesson in that than we did in this election cycle. By the time this is released, the process may have been decided formally, but I'm sure we'll have much more to comment on. So we'll be back at some point later in the month or next to kind of continue the process of figuring out what's going on. But of course, like, share, Make sure you subscribe to this
That's right.
channel. Make sure that you hit the bell, I think. That's what I'm told you need to do so you get
Yep.
alerted when we're here and when we're posting and publishing. And we'll be back with you again very soon.
Bye bye. Peace out.